everyone. Welcome to another edition of Rack and Roll, Future-Proofing Your Warehouse. I'm Ashley Felpash. Today we're exploring how to have the digital conversation. By the end of our conversation, you'll understand Industry 4.0 and how to start the journey. I'm excited to be joined by Mark Fralick, CTO at Softeon. Mark, it's a pleasure to have you on. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
If you could start by introducing yourself, give us a little bit of background, and then we'll jump into our discussion.
Sure. Thank you again for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be on with you. Again, the name is Mark Fralick. I've been in the WMS industry since the late 80s. I can tell by my luxurious gray hair that I've been through some go-lives. I started back in the day with a company called McHugh, which became, Red Prairie, JDA, Blue Yonder. Along the way, I built an architecture called Mocha, which is the underlying architecture of that system. Sold it to Red Prairie, and then went off and did my own thing for the next 20 years or so, and then recently joined Softeon, where I'm back with my original cohort, Jim Heflin, who he and I are the ones that built the Blue Yonder WMS, sold it to them, and now we're working for Softeon. So I've been around a bit. I specialize really in automation, and I hesitate to call it integration, but I would say ways for systems to converse with each other.
Absolutely. That's a great explanation. And yeah, it's no secret that everyone in the industry calls you a pioneer. So we're excited to have you on. And automation is definitely the topic these days, and how people can integrate it, which is where our discussion will head to. So Industry 4.0, it's a big buzzword these days. Can you break that down, and what does it mean for supply chain, and why should businesses care about it?
Sure. I think it helps to understand where, the previous versions, people kind of classify the previous version. So really starting in with, version 1 was really, from our independence through about 1870, 1880, with the emergence of automated, more automated lines for production, and then electricity, and then shift forward to, that was version 2. And so version 3 was the inclusion of electronic computing, so call that the late 60s. And then now it's more of sort of cyber physical, so the joining of physical and electronics together more as sort of the 4.0 version of that. And I think it's interesting that, some of these elements were spurred by, different philosophies of how to do things. So that 2.0 was really about, making production lines, right, and things like that. Version 3 was really about opportunistically taking advantage of computing technology that came along. And then, the distance between, call that 1969 and now, really what's happened is a whole slew of new technologies come along that enable, things at a much broader scale. The ability for us to talk amongst things, either from, Wi-Fi, which is, everywhere now, or inexpensive cellular devices, right? That gives you the ability to talk to everything sort of, at any point in time. And so just as to talk about how that's a little bit different and how that's accelerating, just think about your car, right? If you buy a new car these days, right, it's like I always say, my car is so critical of my driving. Hey, you're too far to the left, you're too far to the right. There's a car coming this way, there's a car coming that way. Toll tags, automated toll tags, and things like that are all Industry 4.0 enablers, right? And so, these are things that allow us to have autonomous vehicles, all those elements, right? And as you know, right, we've been doing autonomous vehicles contained within warehouses really since, the first one I did was 2012, I want to say, something like that. And so because we've been contained within the four walls, it was a bit easier for us to get that technology, because we don't have, the omnidirectional threat of your neighbor pulling out of the driveway, right, when you're pulling out and things like that. So, but really, I think the thing that's been frustrating, and if you go to a show like ProMat, which is coming up here, in March. I think what you'll see is a whole slew of innovation, and I kind of just put this under the global term of Industry 4.0 innovation, which might be software, might be AI, might be hardware, all those things coming together. But all these things sort of screaming to try and get into the supply chain, get onto the floor of the warehouse, get into the yard, get out to the vehicles, right? They're screaming, and unfortunately, what it's sometimes our thought processes around how to deal with that is the major obstacle. It's not technology one; it's like how we think about things, and that's I think if you look through that show and talk to the vendors, you'll find that frustration, right? And like how do we make it easier for organizations to consume that, consume the technology, but also handle the change management part. So those are the things that are happening right now, right, kind of out there. I know that was a lot to unpack. So.
No, that's great. It's a great breakdown, and it's very true. There's a huge shift going on, and it's how do we manage the strategy of it rather than just implementing it.
Yeah.
On the topic of transformation, how do you see emerging technologies like IoT, AI, and robotics reshaping supply chain management today?
So I always like to look at it from an operational objective side of things, because people think about automation and think about robotics as like, hey, is that an FTE play? Is that a reduction in full-time equivalents, or is that so I think the first thing that I like to think about is the objective, right? Is the objective, like operationally, are you trying to achieve a scalability, right? Is that a scalability play? So that like during Christmas, during Black Friday, and whatever your busy season is, can you scale your operation? Because scaling the operation is more than just adding more bodies, right? Sometimes it's just not possible, right? And so from that side of things, I think what happens is people get all these mixed thought processes, and they're like, well, hey, we can reduce this, we can do that. So I think that fundamentally, I think you need to look at it and say, okay, what is my main driver? What's the main element that's going to add to my business and solve the main problem that I have? Obviously, it's all about revenue generation, but sometimes that really is more about like, hey, we know that 80% of our revenue comes in within 2 months of the year. How do we optimize around that? Versus, or you could say, look, I've got all these remote distribution centers, and I've got elements of that we need to combine into one and make sure that transportation. So I think that from my perspective, what I find is that there's so many different things that people have a little bit of a hard time saying, okay, what is my main objective, right? And so I think, when you go to a show like ProMat, or you start to consider all these things, I think it boils down to it can be so confusing for an organization to start to make those value choices to say, look, the first thing we need to do is solve this scalability problem for this 2 months of the year. Or if this is an FTE play, you could say, okay, well, look, across my entire organization, it may, the big obvious step may not be, adding robots. It might be to, facilitate better communication and coordination of what shipping points we're using. So I think what happens to me, what I find is that there's so many options that people get a little frozen, in terms of evaluating them. And I think that's one of the bigger issues that I see out there, right?
Yeah. And I think relaying that back to life too, if you've got so many decisions or so many shiny new objects in front of you, it's like, which one do you pick? And I think that's a good point, and that's how a partner can help you. I know at Trian Solutions, one of our things is to help you with your strategy. So we go and look at your operations, can help you figure out those things. So if you are having a hard time with that, bringing in a partner is a great way to help you sort out those decisions.
Yeah, and I would say that too, that the folks over at Trian I've known for, this is I don't plug anybody, but I'm just saying I just talk about people that are good at what they do, right? And so you always want to have people that are good at what they do, on your side. And I've known some of the folks from Trian for over 20 years, and you don't stick around this industry for long without being good at what you do. So bring in a partner who's seen a lot, like Tryon is always a good step, to help you sort out the variabilities of those decisions. Yeah.
Exactly. And I guess that kind of segues into the next question I have is, what steps can organizations take to start the digital conversation with their teams to start this transformation?
Yeah, I think that it starts with understanding what your obstacles are. So if what I always like to say is the business that you are right now versus the business that you want to be a year from now or 2 years from now. Like, the hardest thing that we have to deal with is solving the getting from here to there problem, right? I mean, that's always, but that starts with understanding what the there is. Like, where do you want to be in a year? And so I think that sometimes is the hardest thing to get to. For instance, we were talking about this idea that, is this a scalability problem, right? Or is it a FTE problem? They didn't tear out all those toll booths everywhere that had people in them to save 4 people in each direction, per shift. They said, look, we have to scale this so that people don't have to slow down and we don't cause traffic jams. We don't have to have a capital improvement project every time we want to improve, get more throughput. So the goal there was around increasing throughput, a very simple increasing throughput, get the cars through there faster, safer. So I think, organizations have to start with that sort of North Star. What is that thing that we want to be? And then start to work, because like we said, there's so many options, right? You could say, well, hey, I'm going to put in this robot to solve this one problem. Well, does spending the money there stop you from a bigger, more organic solution elsewhere, right? And so, that's part of the problem. And I think, so defining that North Star, and then working the getting from here to there problem in steps that give you a ROI along the way is the best choice of action here.
Absolutely. I love that example of North Star because it really determines on where you want to be. And it's just like in your personal life, again, you can find that North Star in your personal life, you can find it for your business.
Yeah, exactly.
So, exactly. And so when companies are considering this, obviously there's a lot at stake, financials, production, ROI, things like that. So for companies who are hesitant to start the journey, what risks do they face if they just stay status quo and don't jump into this industry 4.0?
Yeah, so these aren't the days where you're going to lose by small increments. As companies take this technology on, they're making large improvements, right? They're potentially making large scalability improvements, large cost improvements. So if you don't, you could sort of incrementally, organically make your change, and that might get you a percentage increase per year. Whereas the folks that are taking this on might make an exponential change. So every year they're exponentially further ahead of you, right? And so that's the danger. And I completely understand it, actually. And so I think that the way I always think about this is again, define what that North Star is, but look at small chunks that you can POC, you can do proof of concept, you can do pilots, you can get some incremental ROI. Now, a lot of the robot vendors, as an example, in our space, in the WMS space, the robot vendors will do pilots, and they'll map out their ROI, they'll map out their FTE reduction, they'll map out their scalability, and in many cases, you can do some nice steps that protect you from let's say, a CapEx perspective, because you can do it at a smaller cost within an operational budget, and then potentially, because of their economic models that the robot vendors, in this case, in my example, are trying to keep this as an OpEx sort of thing, where the operational expenses really come in as like a robots as a service thing. It's almost like you're hiring a robot, right? On a monthly basis, it costs you $1,200 per robot, let's say, or something like that. And so between those two things, I think you can model this in steps. Again, as long as you have that North Star defined, you can challenge the vendors who really want to get their tech to the field, right? You can challenge them to say, okay, here's the problems I'm trying to solve, but we also have to make sure that along the way, we're adding the proof points, but we're adding ROI as we go, right? And so you can do this in steps and still, and then once you get to a certain degree, then you can accelerate, right? Now you're with that group that's moving exponentially, right? But don't be afraid of doing the small steps first to prove everything out, to make sure you don't have a big exposure, right, from a risk or from a cost perspective. So I think that those are the things that I think of as both challenges and opportunities to get in the game. Like you're starting in the slow lane, but you want to move over to the fast lane, right? So we can start in the slow lane and then shift over to the fast lane.
Absolutely, that's a great point. I think that having that mentality going into it will help for success in the long run. So we talked a little bit earlier about partnerships and how other companies can kind of help. So on a more collaborative note, how does teamwork and partnership drive a successful digital transformation? And do you have an example from Softeon or your background to share?
Yeah, I think that I always think of it this way, that sometimes our degrees of success or failure really are partly due to our ability to imagine, the best possible or the best possible states, or even a good state moving forward. And I think that what we've seen over the last several years, and this is part of what I built a company, and we built a bunch of intellectual property around how to integrate with how to pull in, how to communicate better with the electronic infrastructure of robots and even conveyors and things like that. And I think that what we see is if we can make a more collaborative way to communicate between systems, right? Not just point-to-point interfaces, right? I think we've left that world of point-to-point interfaces. I mean, they're still necessary, but that's sort of the easy part of an integration. But what we find is that there might be many more parties interested in the communication between you and the robots, or you and the conveyors, or what's going on with the system, right? That can drive ML, machine learning, or AI. And I think that from my perspective, that collaboration now becomes much more important at a sort of functional level of communication, more even than the old way of saying, well, hey, we're gonna put a couple developers in the back room, let them tinker out an interface, right? That to me is no longer the way to fly, right? The way to fly is to think about this from a functional perspective and say, whereas a WMS used to only be interested in getting divert confirms, so confirmations of diverts on a conveyor, now we might want to understand more, like, hey, how many misreads are we having, and does that push back into our the way we have compliance back into our vendors? Does that, how does that push to make our entire operational more, or our entire organization more effective as far as achieving its goals? So I think that what we're seeing and what we're trying to do is really up the level of communication, so that other parties who are interested in quality or efficiency or even just doing simple BI sort of displays and things like that, have them more available. And I think it changes the way you start to think about the conversations that need to happen, right? It's not just a technical conversation, just like driving your car. There's no technical conversation. It's just letting you know it doesn't like you driving that close to the center lane, right? And so it doesn't have to be a technical conversation. It has to be more of a functional conversation to say, how can we get our organization, whether that's just the DC or DCR, what degree of that organization can we talk at a higher level so that we get that information available to other systems? And to me, that's the biggest thing, going back to the Industry 4.0 thought process. We have to get out of this private interfaces world of talking about things and go into more of electronic conversations happening that you might want to make available to other partners and other players in your space, right? That can put their thumb on the scale of like when you should move this trailer in, or when you should do this, or things like that. So I think I didn't directly answer your question, but I'm kind of going in the direction of where I see us wanting to go with this, because obviously I've been in the field for 30 years, and I feel like we have not move the needle as an industry enough. And that's what led me to build an organization that built this technology and then now, moved it into Softeon because of my frustration hearing from the vendors that show up at ProMat saying, it's all obstacles for me to get this stuff to the field, right? We have to reduce those obstacles. To me, that's the big goal. And that's why I get so excited about this field is all we have to do is remove some of the fences, man, and we can really move forward.
Yeah, absolutely. And collaboration is truly the backbone of success, and aligning shared goals makes all the difference. So it's,
For sure.
yeah, it's reach out to people, have the conversations, and thank you for that, because the digital conversation came from you, which is such a true story of this industry 4.0 and something that has to happen before anything is put into production or invested in.
Yeah.
So thanks everybody for joining us on this episode of Rack and Roll. We hope you enjoyed our discussion on how to have the digital conversation and have more insight on it. If you have any questions or want to learn more, feel free to reach out. Our contact information is in the description below. Until next time, see you soon.